This is NBC News Capsule, sponsored by Budweiser Light Beer. Here is Bill Schechner.
Good evening. Authorities in Caracas, Venezuela now say the death toll from an out-of-control oil storage fire could reach 200. 300 people have been injured. The fire has been burning since Sunday and could continue for another 5 or 6 days as firefighters wait for it to burn itself out. OPEC ministers today agreed to freeze the price of oil at $34 a barrel, but they didn't agree on production quotas, which means the actual price may continue to drop. More in a moment.
Discover the clean, distinctive taste of a light beer worthy of the king of beers.
First Lady Nancy Reagan today had a small abnormal growth removed from her lip. She's now said to be feeling fine, and she hosted a White House Christmas party after the operation. I'm Bill Schechner in New York. More news later on this NBC station and on NBC News overnight.
This is NBC News Capsule, sponsored by Coleco. Here is Lloyd Dobbins.
Good evening. President Reagan today asked Congress to settle the nationwide rail strike. In announcing the decision, Transportation Secretary Drew Lewis said the nation could not afford a prolonged rail strike, and General Motors has already had to close a St. Louis plant because it couldn't ship parts in. In other labor news, National Football League players have called a strike for tomorrow. More news in a moment.
Now you can play Exidy's Venture with multiple screens on your ColecoVision, Atari VCS, or Intellivision video game system. Exidy's Venture, the hot new cartridge, is here.
That special commission studying Social Security is considering a number of proposals to rescue the system from a threatened financial crisis. Among them, a 14% increase in Social Security taxes and higher levies on upper-income wage earners. I'm Lloyd Dobbins in New York. More news later on NBC News Overnight.
NBC News Update, sponsored by Chuck Wagon Dog Food. Here is John Dancy.
Good evening. Angry reaction today from Senate Armed Services Committee Chairman John Tower to President Reagan's plan to revitalize America's defense.
The MX decision appears to have been made within a small circle without the coordination of the best technical and military experts.
Mr. Reagan wants to build 100 B-1 bombers and 100 MX missiles, the missiles to be placed in existing Titan and Minuteman silos. Stocks were up again today, the 5th day in a row. And Poland's Solidarity Labor Union today re-elected Lech Walesa, head of the union, rejecting 3 hardliners who favored more confrontation with the government. I'm John Dancy in Washington. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest, sponsored by new Ara XX Solid Musk. Here is Chuck Scarborough, NBC News.
Good evening. A Kuwaiti newspaper says the Soviet Union has told the United States it would not honor any American blockade of Libya, and that it would use Soviet warships to keep the sea lanes open. 6 people filed affidavits in federal court today charging the federal government suppressed evidence that American prisoners of war are still being held in Indochina. The affidavits documented sightings of possible POWs. One as recently as last October. Now this.
Some people perspire.
We sweat. So for us, Ara XX Solid.
With the great new musk scent, helps keep us extra
dry.
Well, finally, a baby killer whale born yesterday at San Diego SeaWorld is doing well. She weighs in at 350 pounds and is 7 feet long. And this baby hasn't even been named yet. Some baby. I'm Chuck Scarborough in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is Linda Ellerby.
Good evening. President Reagan has asked the Justice Department to check out the alleged use of Jimmy Carter's briefing papers by the Reagan side during the 1980 campaign debates. The long dominant Christian Democrats hold only a narrow lead over the communists in the Italian national elections, but are expected to win. The Supreme Court ruled today that states are allowed to tax multinational corporations on their worldwide profits. It means hundreds of millions in new state tax revenues. And the Space Shuttle Challenger starts home to Cape Canaveral tomorrow, bolted to a jumbo jet. The trip will take 2 days. I'm Linda Ellerby in New York. More news later on this NBC station and on NBC News Overnight.
This is NBC News Update, sponsored by Ideal Toys. Here is Bob Jameson.
Good evening. After raising its price yesterday, Saudi Arabia announced today it would cut its oil production. That probably means the world oil glut will end by spring with higher gasoline prices to follow in the U.S. Treasury Secretary Donald Regan today gave the administration's first official acknowledgement that it probably won't balance the budget by 1984 as promised. The President and Mrs. Reagan got clean bills of health today after an overnight stay at Bethesda Naval Hospital for their annual checkups. Doctors said the President is fully recovered from last spring's assassination attempt. And in Sweden, while the Soviet sub is still stuck near a top-secret naval base, there is now an agreement for the Russian captain to be questioned by Swedish authorities. I'm Bob Jameson in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Update, brought to you by Budweiser. Here is Jane Pauley.
Good evening. Poland's Communist Party chief Stanislaw Kania met today with Czech leader Gustav Husak, who warned that Poland looks like Czechoslovakia before the Soviet invasion in 1968. In Atlanta, the list of black children found dead is up to 17. Another child was identified today. Home heating oil will soon cost $1.50 a gallon, according to the chairman of the board of Amoco. Former Beatle Ringo Starr has joined Paul McCartney on the Caribbean island of Montserrat. Sources say the surviving Beatles will reunite to make an album dedicated to the late John Lennon. I'm Jane Pauley in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is Chuck Scarborough, NBC News.
Good evening. The United States today sent William Quinn, a suspected member of the Irish Republican Army, to England to face trial for murder. Quinn appealed extradition all the way to the Supreme Court, but he lost. A Nicaraguan court today charged American flyer Eugene Hasenfuss with terrorism and violating public order. The prosecution said it will show Hasenfuss was acting as an agent of U.S. policy. Now this.
The 35mm automatic one-touch from Nikon. It puts great photography at everybody's fingertips.
General Motors said today is pulling out of South Africa for business and moral reasons. And Klaus von Bülow testified for the first time under oath that he did not try to kill his rich wife. I'm Chuck Scarborough in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is John Dancy, NBC News.
Good evening. The Iceland summit between President Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev has collapsed. It ended with no agreement after the Soviets insisted on linking any arms control agreement to the U.S. Strategic Defense Initiative. As NBC News Chief White House correspondent Chris Wallace reports, the Reagan administration is angry over the outcome.
The two leaders met for 7.5 hours, but when they emerged from Hofty House tonight, both looked grim. They had reached remarkable agreements, including one to eliminate all ballistic missiles over 10 years. But the talks broke down over the president's Star Wars defense plan. Just before leaving Iceland, Mr. Reagan explained the problem.
The Soviet Union insisted that we sign an agreement that would deny to me and to future presidents for 10 years the right to develop, test, and deploy a defense against nuclear missiles for the people of the free world. This we could not and will not do.
No, there will not be another summit in the near future that I can see at this time. The Soviets are the ones that refuse to make the deal. It shows them up for what they are.
U.S. officials say they made more progress on arms control this weekend than in the last 4 years. But as the president headed home, they wondered how much the battle over Star Wars has damaged U.S.-Soviet relations. Chris Wallace, NBC News, Reykjavik.
Secretary of State Schultz said U.S. officials were deeply disappointed. According to Schultz, Mr. Reagan and Gorbachev made progress on major cuts in long-range missiles. They were near agreement on limiting missiles in Europe and made progress on limiting underground nuclear tests. Mr. Reagan also offered to limit research and testing on Star Wars missile defense, but Gorbachev insisted on an outright ban on testing. Schultz said it was this linkage that scuttled the talks. Schultz said the president, with great reluctance, decided he simply had to refuse. I'll have more on the summit in a moment. After the talks broke down, Mikhail Gorbachev insisted he had made major concessions and said President Reagan took a stand only a madman would accept. Tonight, Mr. Reagan is on the way home from Iceland. The climb to the summit stalled. No date for a summit has been set, and there was not even a joint statement at the end. Only individual statements in which each leader tried to put his interpretation on the weekend's events. Mr. Reagan will amplify his brief departure statement tomorrow night when he addresses the nation at 8 o'clock Eastern Time. NBC News will carry his address live. I'm John Dancing in Washington. There will be more news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Update. Here now is Jane Pauley.
Good evening. Government soldiers shot and killed 19 men and women today in San Salvador. Soldiers say they were looking for guerrillas and were fired on first. Survivors say it was a massacre. Libya, in a peace move, will reopen its borders with Egypt tomorrow. Libya closed it 3 years ago when Anwar Sadat made peace with Israel. The United Auto Workers and Ford resume talks tomorrow on their give-and-take wage contract. Ford is offering, among other things, a share in the profits. And singer-composer, guitarist Lightnin' Sam Hopkins has died in Houston at the age of 69. Hopkins was among the last of the old-time country blues men. I'm Jane Pauley in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest, sponsored by Airborne Freight Corporation. Here is Norma Quarles, NBC News.
Good evening. Despite the deaths of 2 U.S. Marines, the size and goal of the American force in Lebanon remains unchanged. This after phone conferences today between President Reagan, Vice President Bush, and State Secretary Shultz. The Soviet news agency TASS today accused the U.S. of direct armed interference in Beirut. Now this.
The next time you're sending 2 packages to the same place, send one by Federal, the other by Airborne. See which one gets there first. Watch out, Federal. Here comes Airborne.
At 2:15 a.m. Eastern Time, the Space Shuttle Challenger lifts off at Cape Canaveral. Its crew includes the first black astronaut and the oldest astronaut. NBC covers the launch live on Overnight. Stepped up calls today for federal help to heat and drought-damaged farms. I'm Norma Quarles in New York. More news later on this NBC station and on NBC News Overnight.
This is NBC News Update, sponsored by Polaroid. Here is Jessica Savage.
Good evening. The House tonight gave its overwhelming approval to President Reagan's plan for another $2.3 billion in unemployment benefits. That to help states with high jobless rates and to reopen many employment service offices. The president, back in Washington tonight, described as very pleased with his 2-day trip to the Midwest to win support for his budget. Mr. Reagan will not have the support of the so-called boll weevils, though. Conservative Democrats told the administration today the projected deficit for fiscal 83 is too high. And Sir Freddie Laker, whose cut-rate airline went out of business last week, said today he'd like to start another called the People's Airline. I'm Jessica Savage in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is Tom Brokaw, NBC News.
Good afternoon. In California, Theodore Streletsky was let out of prison today. He had served 5.5 years for killing his math professor at Stanford, but now he's right back in jail. He had threatened not to cooperate with his parole officers, and almost immediately he did not. And there's new trouble today for Edwin Meese's nomination as Attorney General. The Senate Judiciary Committee delayed its vote for a week to look into new evidence linking Meese to documents taken from Jimmy Carter's 1980 campaign. And finally, thousands of Polish students defied riot police and protested the government decision to remove crucifixes from their classrooms. I'm Tom Brokaw in New York. More news later on this NBC station and on the NBC Nightly News.